Well, glad you're all here tonight. I'm glad to be able to have another chance to speak. I always enjoy these opportunities. I always enjoy the chance to put together a lesson because you learn a lot by having the opportunity to put a lesson together. I did want to mention anytime Cleo is lurking around the corner, you know what he's doing. And whenever he comes at you, he has this little piece of paper, and it's got the names or the listing of all the topics, and it's got, in the right-hand column, it's got the date that topic is correlated to. And I don't know if it's foresight or IVSP or something, but I just had a gut feeling that talking about finding true happiness through the exercise of power on the Wednesday night following the Oscars was going to be pertinent. I just had a feeling. Unfortunately, I didn't watch the Oscars, so I don't know if anything relevant happened. Somebody can fill me in later. But tonight we're talking about finding happiness through the exercise of power. Very interesting topic. When you enter into a lesson, you never know what rabbit trails it's going to take you, so just bear with me. So what comes to mind when you think of power? A lot of things come to mind, right? Maybe objects that have power. Heavy pieces of machinery can have power. Nature, that storm this morning, that was power. Maybe it's people that have power. But usually, at least when I think of power, I often think of it in kind of a negative context, right? Or at least it's something that we don't have. We always think of that other person has more power than I do, and that kind of sets our barometer of determining how much power we see ourselves having. I want to play a little game here if I want to play along. I want you to think about somebody that you think has power, whether that be someone alive today, whether that be a historical figure. Think of someone who has power. Now, we may be getting some world leaders that you're thinking about, past or present. Maybe you're thinking of a powerful business executive, maybe a celebrity, maybe someone who's just extremely wealthy. I want you to raise your hand if the person you thought of was yourself. Okay, good. Y'all proved my analogy good. I appreciate that. We don't think of ourselves as being powerful people. But for the purpose of this lesson, as we go through some of these topics, I want you to have in the back of your mind how powerful you actually are. We're all very incredibly powerful people. Just for example, each and every person in this room has the power within themselves to present and introduce the gospel to somebody. That's a very powerful thing. And on the flip side of that, each and every person in this room has the power within themselves to completely decimate somebody's faith. Whether that be because we did something to drive them away from the church, or maybe we taught them something that was wrong, whatever it may be. The point is, we're all incredibly powerful people, and we use that power on a daily basis. So I want to talk through a couple examples that we find in the Bible of people exercising power. What was the result? First one that came to my mind was in 1 Kings chapter 21. You have the example of Ahab and Jezebel. And Ahab and Jezebel had this neighbor that lived down the street, and he had a vineyard that Ahab really wanted, right? And Jezebel designed this plan. She used her power to have these false charges brought against Naboth, was the man. And eventually these false charges led to him being dragged outside the city and stoned to death. And Ahab and Jezebel got that piece of land that they really wanted. Now, did Ahab and Jezebel get the happiness that they were looking for? Well, maybe. That was the intended result, right? That exercise of power, the intended result was they wanted that piece of property. But what about in the long term? Well, as a result of this exercise of power, what happened? Elijah comes along and delivers some pretty bad news to them, and not too long after that, they were killed well before their time. Another example that came to mind was Daniel chapter 3. We have the story of Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar built this giant golden image, told everyone that when they heard the sound of music, they heard the horn, that everyone had to bow down and worship it. And what was the result if you didn't follow his decree? You were thrown in the furnace. And everyone in the land followed his directions, and to some degree, you could probably say that he was happy because everyone was following along. Until he gets this report that there's these three guys that were not following along. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And Nebuchadnezzar threw them in the furnace. And what happened to them? We're all familiar with the story. Well, nothing happened to them. They were saved by God. Now, did Nebuchadnezzar get the happiness that he was looking for? Well, initially, his intended result was he wanted everyone to follow his decree. And he had a pretty good percentage, all but 3. But in the end, the long-term unintended consequence was what? He was humbled, made a fool, because his actions resulted in something that he was not expecting. Now, what about an example of, those are 2 examples of kind of bad actors. What about Moses, somebody who we would consider to be someone who was good? Moses exercised all sorts of power during his time on earth, right? And I put this picture up there because, one of my favorite stories in the Bible, and one of the reasons for that is I can't even begin to imagine what that felt like, to be in that moment right there. They just fled Egypt after some crazy set of circumstances. He's got all these people. They're free, finally. They got the chariots on their heels, and they come to what seems to be a dead end. And Moses simply raises his hand, and the water parts. In fact, the scripture says that they were able to cross on dry land. So not only did the water part, but every single water molecule separated so they could cross on dry land. That's got to be an incredible feeling. I get excited when I go to Target and I experience the parting of the glass doors by holding up my hand and waving at the sensor. But in this instance, that's a tremendous amount of power. But was he exercising his power, or was he exercising God's power? He was exercising God's power. Now, what about a different example of when he exercised some power? When it wasn't necessarily God's power. Numbers chapter 20 tells us a story of Moses, and the people of Israel his people are thirsty, they're hungry, they want to go back. And God tells Moses to speak to the rock, and water would come out so they could drink. And instead, what did he do? He struck it with his staff. They got the water. That was the intended consequence, wasn't it? That was the intended result. They wanted water. He got that intended result, so you could say in some way that made him happy. But obviously we know how that story ends, and because he didn't trust God, God did not allow him to see the promised land. So there's always, when we exercise power, there's an intended result of what we're searching for, but it's always that unintended consequence that usually trips us up and robs us of our happiness. Now, fast forward to today, there was a study done a couple years ago that asked this very question. And the study was trying to determine, does happiness come from the exercise of power? And this wasn't a biblical study, it was a secular study done. Basically what they did is they surveyed a couple hundred people, and they were trying to determine whether happiness comes from power in the workplace, in social settings, and in your marriage and your home life. And here was the conclusion. This is going to blow your minds. People in power tend to be happier. I think we can all understand why they came to that conclusion. But what's interesting to me about the study is they gave us this conclusion, but then they go into why they came to that conclusion, their reasoning. And this is the reasoning, and I'm going to read it to you. It says, being in a position of power causes people to feel more authentic and true to themselves. That is, it allows their actions to more closely reflect their beliefs and desires. Feelings of authenticity, in turn, enhance subjective feelings of well-being and happiness. By leading people to be true to their desires and inclinations, to be authentic, power leads individuals to experience greater happiness. I think another way to put that is power reveals our true character. We hear that sometimes. But it's interesting, to me, the reasoning doesn't necessarily line up with the conclusion. Because my takeaway from the study is happiness doesn't necessarily come from power, but happiness comes from authenticity, which comes from power. And in a shallow way, I think that's pretty accurate and has some truth to it. You hear people a lot talk about, they feel lost in their life and they don't know what to do, and they talk about finding themselves, or they need to go on this journey of self-discovery. That's what people say when they're trying to find that authenticity. They're searching for happiness by trying to find what they believe to be authenticity. And that's a difficult thing to find if you're living out in the world. But for the people living in this room, we have a different perspective, right? Because we know that the purest form of authenticity is being a child of God. So let's dig into this concept of power a little bit more. And we need to talk about happiness for a minute, which is the kind of the series that we're in. So I won't stay on that too long, but we want to talk about what is happiness. We want to talk about what is power. And I want to talk about what exercising power is and what it means. So the happiness that we're searching for, and I'm going to piggyback off of what Todd said last week, the happiness that we're talking about in the context of this class is that long-term, sustained, godly happiness while we're here on the earth. We talk about, or we have these feelings of intermittent spurts of temporary satisfaction, but that doesn't sustain us. Go talk to Ahab and Jezebel. But on the other end, we're also not talking about joy necessarily. When I think of joy, I'm thinking of being able to live this life with the hope of knowing what's to come. So tonight we're talking about long-term sustained happiness while we're here on the earth. So what is power? People have a lot of things to say about what power is. A lot of people say knowledge is power. Is that true? It sounds pretty smart, so it's probably true, right? We hear it a lot. I dug into this a little bit because I got interested, and it was first coined by a scientist and philosopher by the name of Sir Francis Bacon. Now, I don't know about you, but anybody named Sir Francis Bacon, I'm gonna rely on the information they have, and then couple that with that outfit. I think we're in good hands. But I want you to keep in mind that this was coined in 1597, right? And Bacon was one of these guys. He was a smart guy, and he believed that knowledge is something that should be categorized, replicated, and shared. And in his view, having and sharing knowledge was the cornerstone of reputation and influence, and therefore power. But keep in mind, in 1597, knowledge wasn't readily available. It wasn't at your fingertips. This was well before the internet. This was well before dictionaries. This was well before the Encyclopedia Britannica infomercials. But the printing press had been invented, but at the same time, there wasn't a lot of production at that time to have it readily available at your hands. So in 1597, I think that was probably true. But in today's world, everything you could possibly want to know is sitting in your pocket right now. Knowledge is everywhere. Knowledge is readily available. And it's hard to say that knowledge is power without knowing what you're going to do with that knowledge, right? There's always an action that's associated with it. So let's talk about what power actually is. This is the definition. This is Webster's. Power is the capacity or ability to direct or influence the behavior of others or the course of events. Now I want to hone in on two words here, capacity or ability. I like to think of this like a bucket. Each and every one of us has a bucket of power. And we can put more in, we can take it out. If someone's, if we're mad at someone, we can dump our power out on them, we can empty the bucket. But it's something that can fluctuate, but it's also something that can just sit there and you not do anything with it. Power is not inherently good or bad. If you have a concordance in your Bible and you look at the word power, most often it's either referring to the power of God or the power of evil. So there's a juxtaposition to what power is. It's something we all have to varying degrees, but it's something we all want more of, whether we want to admit it or not. Because we love to be in control, we like the thought of being our own boss and in being in control of our own life and our own decisions. Power is possessible. And I don't think that's a word, but you know exactly what I'm talking about. It's not something you can physically hold in your hands, but at the same time, it kind of is. It's something you can find, you can lose it, you can give it away, you can buy it, you can sell it, you can steal it, you can lose it again, you can find it again. It's transferable. And the relevance of the power we have comes when we interact with other people. And that's what creates what we call a power dynamic. And every time you're having an interaction with somebody, there's a power dynamic at play. And if that power dynamic is healthy and it can balance itself out, you're probably going to have a pretty good relationship. Put it in another way, when I wake up in the morning, I'm in my own home, and I have my wife and I have my 3 kids, and I am the king of the castle in my own house. And I share that power with my wife. And With my 3 kids, I have a lot of power, right? I can determine what it is they do. I can determine what they eat. I can determine the things they watch on TV. I can have a pretty significant outcome on the kind of person they're going to be when they grow up. Especially with my boys. My boys are relatively obedient. You might have to say it a couple times, but they eventually get the drift. But then my daughter, my 3-year-old daughter, walks in the room, and it's like she comes and just kicks my bucket over. I don't know where the power goes. It just dissipates. It's gone. But then I get in my car, and I drive to work. And I don't own my own business, so I'm no longer the king of the castle. My boss is the CEO of the company I work for, and if he comes and asks me to do something, as long as it's within the realm of reason, I'm probably going to do it, because that's how that works. But then lunchtime rolls around, and man, I'm at the most powerful I am in my whole day, because guess what? Options are unlimited. I can eat whatever I want. I can go wherever I want. And I go to that restaurant, and I sit down, and the guy gives me a menu, and he says, "What do you want?" And I can point to anything on that menu, and guess what he's going to do? He's going to bring it to me. Talk about power, right? But then lunch is over, and I get back in my car, and I'm thinking about how good my lunch was, and I'm not really paying attention to what I'm doing, and I see those lights flashing behind me. Now I got this guy up next to my window. He's knocking on the window, and the power dynamic shifted pretty drastically, because this guy standing outside my window has got the full force of the state of Texas behind him, and he has the power to pull me over and give me a ticket if I break the law. And this analogy reminds me of Matthew chapter 18, the parable of the unmerciful servant. I think we're all familiar with it. But the debtor in this story owed a significant amount of money, 10,000 talents, to his master, but he was unable to pay. And the master ordered that he, his wife, and his kids be sold in order to pay off that debt. And the debtor begged for mercy. "Please give me more time. Be patient with me. I can pay it off." And the master decided to show mercy and forgive the debt. Now, again, this is a parable, so we don't know how much time passed, but in the very next verse, the exact same situation is happening, except the power dynamic has shifted. The debtor is now the one with power because somebody else owes him money, even though it's a much lower amount. Now, once that power has shifted, what does he decide to do with that power? He abuses it. And I think it says he chokes him and demands payment. And I've always liked this parable for a variety of reasons, but one of those reasons is it's one of those parables on the surface seems like kind of a silly example that Jesus could give. But I think everyone in here can know and understand that it's not a silly example because it depicts us on a very regular basis. And I think the parable, though we often talk about it in a different context, is one that reiterates one of the more difficult aspects of being a Christian, which is finding the ability to navigate these different situations we find ourselves in. In 1 minute, we can be very weak. In the next minute, we can be very powerful. How, as Christians, do we maintain that evenness that we're required to have as children of God? Not always an easy thing to do. But where does power get its value? Power gets its value from the recognition and acceptance of others. Power's value is subjective upon the recipient who is seeing that power or viewing that power. In other words, we're talking about perception. Perception gives power its value. And I want to make a distinction between what power is and what the value of that power is. So, for example, let's say the President of the United States were to walk in this room right now. Every single person in here would be able to recognize who that is, and we would recognize that the position he holds has a tremendous amount of power. It's undisputable. Across the world, you were to ask, who's the most powerful person in the world? And they would say the President of the United States. Now, let's say he were to leave and walk down to where all the kiddos are right now. Let's say the younger kiddos, 3- and 4-year-olds. Would anybody in there have that similar reaction? No, nobody would care. Kids wouldn't care. They wouldn't recognize who he was. They wouldn't recognize the power that he holds. Does that mean that the President of the United States no longer has power? Or does that mean that in that moment, the value of his power has been diminished because no one in that room recognizes or accepts the power that he has? Talking about this perception of power, does the perception of power have to be based in truth in order to hold value? I think we all know the answer to that. The answer is no. It doesn't have to be true to hold value. Maybe that's why lying is such a powerful tool. Maybe that's why Satan is so successful each and every day, being the master of lies. So think about it this way. Whenever we hear a new piece of information, right? You hear something new for the very first time, your brain does a lot of different things. But the first thing your brain is doing is trying to figure out what it is that information means. And what your brain is doing is forming a perception. So for those of you who do not know me, I went to Harvard University, and I graduated at the top of my class. Now, you're probably thinking to yourself, wow, that's really impressive. And you're thinking that's impressive because in our society, we put a lot of value on how smart people are. We put a lot of value on where you went to school. And I went to Harvard, so that makes me smart. And not only did I go to Harvard, but I graduated at the top of my class, so that makes me the smartest of the smart. And you've made that determination about me before you've even had a chance to contemplate whether or not it's even true. And if you do believe it's true, that makes me powerful. That gives me power because we place a lot of value in that type of information. But for those of you who do not, or for those of you that do know me, you know that I did not go to Harvard. I did not graduate at the top of my class at Harvard. Rather, I graduated from Harding University as the tallest in my class. And that may have some value, but not near as much value. But that's what we're talking about. I go back to the definition of power that we put up earlier, the capacity or ability to direct or influence the behavior of others or the course of events. We can direct or influence the behavior of others whether or not we're using power that's based in truth or whether we're using power that's not based in truth. So let's talk about this concept of exercising. I don't know about you guys, but I love to exercise. That was my wife. Like I said, it doesn't have to be true to hold value. I don't love to exercise. But that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about the concept of exercising something, right? In other words, to put into action, practice, or use in order to achieve a desired goal. Think back to our example we had with Ahab and Jezebel, right? They exercised their power. They put into action, practice, or use in order to achieve a desired goal. Now, the thing about exercising power is built within the concept of exercising is the existence of a choice. You can only exercise something that is available to you. You have to have an opportunity available to you in order to exercise it. You can't exercise something you don't have. Think about, we hear people talk about, I'm going to exercise my rights. Well, what does that mean? That means you have rights, and you can either choose to exercise those rights or to not exercise those rights. If you live in this country, you have those rights. If you don't live in this country, you can't exercise those same rights. And I would argue, if you think about all the way back to the beginning of time, back to Adam and Eve, human beings have been exercising power ever since God gave Adam and Eve the option to eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, right? He put the tree there. He didn't put a big fence around it, prevent them from going to it. He put the tree there and said, don't eat it. Well, what does that do? That creates an option. It creates an opportunity for them to exercise or to not exercise. Another question I want to ask you, do you have to exercise the power that you have? Of course not. We mentioned the bucket example earlier. You could just sit there if you wanted to. And that's where this concept comes in. Matthew chapter 5, verse 5 says, "Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth." Now, meekness is usually something, at least in the sense of modern-day worldly meekness, it's considered a negative, right? Typically, when we think of someone who is meek, they are quiet, gentle, easily imposed upon, submissive, someone you can easily run over and get your own way. So I Googled the word meekness. And you know when you Google a word, this little box pops up on Google, and it'll give you kind of a dictionary little box. Excuse me. And it'll give you the word, how to pronounce it, language of origin, definition, and then at the very bottom, it'll give you that word used within a sentence. And this is a screenshot. This is real. This is something I took a couple days ago. And if you notice at the bottom, the word, it's in quotes at the very bottom, the word used in a sentence, it says, all his best friends make fun of him for his meekness. Now, if that just doesn't epitomize the world's view of what meekness is, I don't know what will. But meekness is not weakness. Rather, meekness, at least in a biblical sense, is exercising, again, we're talking about this concept of exercising. Meekness is exercising God's strength under God's control. We think about Jesus. We sing the song, he could have called 10,000 angels, right? Jesus, the most powerful person who ever lived, in that moment, he could have made it all go away with the power that he had. And at the moment where most people would consider Jesus to be at his weakest, that was the moment of the greatest example of strength that this world has ever seen. And to me, that's what the difference between meekness is and weakness is. Because weakness is when you don't have that opportunity in front of you. We talk about you can't exercise something you don't have, right? Weakness is when you don't have that opportunity in front of you. You're trapped. There's no way out. Meekness is having that option in front of you, but choosing not to exercise it for God's glory. We're called to be meek, and just because we have the power to do something doesn't mean we should, even if we believe that exercising that power might provide us with happiness. Now that we got all the background out of the way, I want to talk about this once again. The concept that we're trying to discover tonight is, does true happiness come from the exercise of power? And, I mentioned before, exercising power implies a choice, but it doesn't imply a negative choice or positive choice. It can be either. Now, if we, looking at the definition for power again, if we direct or influence the behavior of others in a positive way, that's a good thing, right? You would consider that to be unselfish. However, if we direct or influence the behavior of others in a negative way, to me, that's kind of the definition of selfishness, is it not? Especially when you're talking about to your benefit and to someone else's detriment. And I was thinking a lot about this. I had some pretty good conversations with my steering wheel this week about this. And you can kind of take most sin and trace it back to this idea of sin at its base core value is us exercising our power, right? So think of murder or harming somebody as being the exercise of power over someone else's life or their body. Stealing is the exercise of power over someone's property. Lying is the exercise of power over someone else's perceived knowledge. And again, we all have a lot of power, and we exercise that regularly. But to finish my lesson tonight, I want to look a little bit at the best example we can come up with, and that's Jesus, to determine how it is that Jesus used the power that he had. So we're going to look at Philippians chapter 2, and obviously this is Paul writing a letter to the Philippians, and he's going to be describing Jesus in some very unique ways. Starting in verse 3, it says, "Do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. Rather, in humility, value others above yourselves, not looking to your own interests, but each of you to the interests of others. In your relationships with one another, have the same mindset as Christ Jesus. In your relationships with one another, have the same mindset as I already said that. Verse 6, who being in the very nature of God, did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. Rather, he made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness. And being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross." Now, there's a couple things that Paul is getting across here. One thing he's saying is, do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. He says, value others above yourself. And he says, look out for the interests of others. Now, none of these things we would typically correlate with exercising power. In fact, that's the very opposite of exercising power, right? And then in verse 5, Paul calls for us to have the same mindset of Christ. Well, what does that even mean? Let's rewind just a little bit and think of, where was Jesus before time began? We think of John chapter 1, verse 1. In the beginning, Jesus was in the form of God. He existed as one with God, and he was equal with God. Now look at verse 6 here. It says, who being in the very nature of God did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. Christ did not consider equality with God. Think about the amount of power that was, right? He did not consider the power that he had as being equal to God something to be used to his own advantage. The King James says he did not consider it robbery. Some of your versions might say he did not consider it something or a thing to be grasped, something that had to be held onto, something that had to be retained with jealousy. The glory of equality with God, which Christ enjoyed from eternity, was not something he felt like he needed to have. He didn't have to cling to it, which is the greatest demonstration of lacking in selfish ambition that you're going to find. But then Christ became flesh. We move on to verse 7, and it says, rather, he made himself nothing. Made himself nothing. Some versions say he emptied himself. Some versions say made himself of no reputation. He divested himself of all the glory he had as being an equal to God. And he took upon himself the form of a servant. He didn't come as a king, he didn't come as a nobleman like most expected, but he came as the son of a lowly carpenter. Now, why would Jesus do all this? And the obvious answer was he wasn't looking out for himself. He was doing it for the sake of us. He became a man. He humbled himself, became obedient, died on the cross because it was in our best interest. Do you think this brought Jesus happiness? I can't necessarily recall a scripture that talks about Jesus' feeling of happiness about all this, but I imagine that it did. Matthew chapter 20, starting in verse 27, says, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant. Whoever wants to be first must be your slave. Just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. And you might recall that this is in response to the mother of James and John coming to Jesus like any parent that wanted the best for their kids. And she basically was saying, look, when all this is said and done, I want one of my sons sitting on your left and one sitting on the right. And Jesus basically said, you don't know what you're asking for. Because the first shall be last and the last shall be first. So we've talked about a lot of things tonight. And as I mentioned before, we're all very powerful people. Now, obviously, the last example I gave us was Jesus. It's hard to live up to that, but that's the goal, right? We're all powerful people. We have the power within ourselves to completely alter someone else's life for good or for bad. But much like Jesus, we are at our most powerful when we show the strength of a godly servant. And power exercised for our own benefit and to the detriment of others will never provide us with a long-term sustained happiness. There are so many examples, and we talked about a few of them, but there are so many examples in the Bible of people exercising their power and receiving what the intended expectations were, while not having any idea of what those intended consequences were going to be for them. And usually those unintended consequences is what disrupts our happiness. But when we can put ourselves before others, when we are meek, when we can come to an understanding that power is not something needed to be grasped or collected or retained, we find ourselves as a servant, much like Jesus. And this is a concept, it's very backwards. I think we all recognize that. The world's never going to understand the happiness that comes from putting others before ourselves, the happiness that comes from being a servant of God. But for those of us in here, for being a child of God, we understand that that's the greatest happiness that we can have. Being a child of God, serving others, encouraging others, and not looking out for our own best interests. And that's all I got. Anybody have any comments? Sir?
I have a lot more respect for you now that I found out you didn't go to Harvard.
He's glad I didn't go to Harvard. No, that was a lie. I'm going to be honest, I don't make a habit of lying in front of the congregation. That was specific and solely for an example, so I'll try not to do it again. Anyone else? Let's have a word of prayer.